presentation. I was originally asked to talk about understanding homelessness, and I had a much larger presentation that was a couple of hours. You didn't want that at the end of your day. It was probably more of a workshop, so if there's some interest in learning more about this, I'm happy to chat with you separately. But what I'll talk to you about today is understanding homelessness from our own lens, from a First Nations lens, by looking at the types of cultural interventions we need to be able to address the colonial pathways that affect homelessness in our communities. First, I think we need to understand when we are having these conversations with government, with other systems, what are they talking about with homelessness? Because it may not, in fact, align with our understanding of homelessness. According to the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, homelessness is described as the situation of an individual, a family, or a community without stable, safe, permanent, appropriate housing, or the immediate prospect, means, and ability of acquiring it. So when you look at this definition, it's very much about the physical parts of homelessness. Having a house, having the ability to live in a home that's safe, stable, permanent, meets your needs. You can have all your family in that house. It's got running water, it's got sewage, septic, it's got all the appliances you need, it's got beds, it's appropriate. And you have the money to do that, the means, the ability, you have the skills to get it, you know how to get it, you know where to go looking for it, and there are houses available for you to live in. So that makes sense, right? When we think about homelessness, those make sense. But I want you to think about the people on the street. Do you think maybe they have some of these things and they're still homeless, even if they have the prospect? Maybe they even have money. Maybe there are relatives from RHT, from the Robinson-Huron Treaty Settlement. Maybe they have the money for it, but they don't have a house. Let me tell you, I work in Nipissing. I still do some work there. And after RHT, one of the members there who was living without housing, precariously housed, they went into the urban center because there's not enough houses in Nipissing. That's true of most of our communities, right? Not enough houses for all our members. They went into Sturgeon or North Bay and they offered the landlord, they found a house or apartment, and they told the landlord, I'll give you a year's rent up front. You know what that landlord said to our member? No. So they had the means, they had the prospect, they had the ability to acquire housing that would have been appropriate for them, and they are still homeless. That is part of what we need to understand today. Because homelessness is not something that is static. It's not stays the same. It's fluid. It's a fluid experience. We know people can end up in shelter circumstances, but that can shift. Sometimes they could be in a house, and the next day maybe not. Maybe there's been a fire. Things can change quickly with housing, and we need to think about the circumstances around that, and we know it can change frequently for our members. So if we think about the cultural understanding of Indigenous homelessness or First Nations homelessness, we have to think beyond the definition of homelessness, as I've shared with you right now. We have to think that it's not just about a lack of stable place to live, and that it needs to be understood through our own lens. And that's made up of two parts. We need to think about the impact housing has on our members, their families, and the community, and that impact that comes from our disconnection from our relationship. When we think about homelessness and we think about who we are, what is central to our culture is connection and relationship. With homelessness, we need to think about the fact that many of these people living on the streets in Toronto, maybe living in an encampment outside of our community, in our community, they are saying to us they have a disconnection from their relationships to land, to water, to family, to the animals, to their culture, to their language, and to their identity, and to their kin. We also are hearing from them, we have to recognize that they have an incredible difficulty and experience a lot of challenges in finding ways to reconnect to who they are, to their identity, reconnect to their culture, reconnect to their language, to reconnect to themselves spiritually, emotionally, physically, and who they are as a First Nations person, and a difficulty with the challenges of addressing those lost relationships they've had. We heard from that panel yesterday in the lived experience about that one keynote speaker saying, I did lots of things to harm people. I really harmed relationships, and I'm still living with it to this day. That is in fact what some of our relatives who are living without housing are saying, is they have done things and nobody wants them in their community. They're DCR'd out. They are not wanted in the homes of their family and their kin any longer. They have nowhere to go. The man who rents houses or apartments does not want them in there because they've ruined those apartments. They don't want them to be there. So if we think of housing simply as a physical space, we are missing a big piece of homelessness in our communities that is about connection and relationship. I would say to you that we need to think about homelessness as being multiple types of homelessness for our First Nation members. The first is spiritual homelessness. Think about the lived experience panels that you've heard, the young people, those that were here yesterday. They talked about a sense of spiritual homelessness. They talked about not being connected to their language, to their culture, to the practices. And I would say to you, listening and being a member of RHT, I heard a lot of the members from my community and Nipissing, because I have the ability to listen in on that through my husband, of our off-reserve members saying, you don't want me to come here. I don't feel like I belong. You don't do anything for me. And I know some of this is about racism, but some of it, and I mean, the policies have created that divide between our off-reserve and on-reserve members, but some of it is real. Those colonial harms have made them disconnected from us. So they do not feel like they belong in the community. And like I said, those that we know who are struggling with substance use and have done harms in the community to others, to their family, maybe to the chief and council, they are told, we don't want you here. And I think we can all say, if we are experiencing that in our community right now, it's an us and they. They are the problem. They are the people we need to deal with. They're the ones causing all the thefts, the drug dealers. They. So they don't feel a sense of belonging. The second type of homelessness is a relational homelessness. This is what I heard in that panel yesterday, that disruption of relationships like family and the ability to get access to community supports. Those relationships are gone because of perhaps their behaviors, perhaps because of their illnesses, perhaps because they are simply attempting to survive. And as a result of that, they often feel disconnected from the place they belong, on the land, by the water. That's how we connect with who we are, right, is going back to our land. Now, yes, I live in Nipissing, but my home is Doki's. Like I say that, and I do mean that. That's where my spirit lives, is in Doki's. So that loss of land, and we hear that from our community members who live off reserve, who are maybe stolen from us the residential school, day school, 60s scoop, child welfare, the justice system, they have lost that connection. And the third is the mental and physical homelessness. This is the loss or the lack of stable shelter and getting their needs met, those basic needs. And in those cases, it can often be tied to a person's mental wellness or lack thereof, those challenges they have with addictions or with their mental health. So those are three types of homelessness. If we stop and pay attention only to not getting people a house, we will not keep them housed. They will not be able to be housed because we need to take care of a spirit and we need to create relationships. Homelessness for our people, not surprising, we are disproportionately affected by that. 30% of the homelessness population in Canada are Indigenous. We are overrepresented, particularly by women and youth, and it is 23 times more prevalent in our communities, by our people, I should say, than by anywhere else, by any other population. We also tend to face far greater rates of mental health challenges and substance use issues. The Northeast just released a study talking about homelessness, and homelessness has gone up over 240% in the Northeast region in Ontario. And a great bulk of that population who are experiencing homelessness are our relatives. 240% since the pandemic. That is a lot of people who are struggling. And of that 240%, 30%, we could say, are our people. Much of homelessness for us is rooted in those colonial violences that we've experienced, both the historical ones that I've mentioned, but those that continue when they end up in the ER departments and they don't get the health care they need. When they are profiled and they are arrested and they're put in the justice system. When nobody knows what to do with them and we arrest them because we don't know how to deal with their addictions issues. There is a lot of discrimination that affects our people when it comes to homelessness. You know, I gave you the example of, sorry, not going to rent to you. We know in North Bay, at the colleges and universities, when our relatives come from the Cree Nations, they come down to North Bay for post-secondary, they call the landlord says, yeah, I have a place available. They show up at the door and they see the brown face, oh sorry, it's rented, right? So we know there's discrimination for our people in attempting to get access to housing. And of course, all of those socioeconomic factors that cause the difficulties for us. So poverty, lack of education, unemployment, lack of access to resources like housing. We don't have enough housing in our communities. We can't get enough funding to keep building the houses. For some of us, it's also about land. There's not enough land for our members to all be living in our communities. Those are those factors that make it difficult. Those in our community who deal with homelessness, and when I say community, I don't mean just living on reserve, I mean our members both on and off reserve, who have identified as being Indigenous. These are some of the main characteristics. They've usually been homeless at a younger age, so their homelessness starts often in youth or early 20s. They have often report a lifetime duration of homelessness that's greater than 3 years. They often have symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder from traumas and intergenerational traumas. They have less severe mental illnesses. So it's not often because they're schizophrenic or psychotic, but they do have mental illness. Alcohol dependency is often another characteristic, but also greater and more severe substance use issues that have been long-standing. And they often report a multitude of infectious diseases, perhaps HIV, Hep B, Hep C. So some of the the key causes for homelessness, you know, I don't think any of you are going to be surprised to see this list. Colonization. Colonization is often at the root of our struggles. The fact that we have experienced violence that has caused us to be dispossessed from our homelands, from our culture, from our language. All of those forced attempts at cultural genocide and removal of our people from our land have disempowered us to be able to attend to meeting our needs and can put us in a vulnerable place of becoming homeless. And the lack of access to resources and services and programs that truly understand the experiences of our people. Those of you who work in our community have probably heard from somebody who said, I went and met with a counselor, a psychologist, and they had no clue about residential school, day school, 60s school, whatever you want it. And it's safer for me to talk to you, but I'm told I have to talk to somebody else. But we don't have enough services and supports for them. We don't have culturally relevant tools to assist them in addressing their needs. The second, of course, intergenerational trauma from all of that colonial violence has led to that loss of identity, the loss of our family and community relationships, has led to the loss of the stability in our communities. RHT has been a tough thing for those of you living in RHT country. I bet you would agree with me, right? Lots of negative comments, lateral violence towards off-reserve, on-reserve members, chief and council, what they did and didn't do. Lots of harming each other that we continue to give to each other because we are a people without enough resources. And so when we get some, we are fighting to get as much as we can. You know, so that does not go, again, it does not meet our values of collectively caring for each other. And all of those have impacts to our well-being. Overrepresentation in the child welfare and justice system, again, a form of colonial violence. Those high rates of our children in the child welfare system that eventually end up in the youth justice system and then on to the adult correctional institution can lead to housing instability because they've lost contact with their families and their community. They don't know how to get access to housing, how to come back to the community. They also don't have the skills to acquire a house. They may not have the skills to keep up a house. And I have heard from my colleagues that people who had good skills to care for themselves, care for their home, as a result of the substance use, they've lost those skills because substance use is a form of a brain injury. So they've lost the skills to be able to have and take care and maintain a home. Systemic discrimination. Those barriers we have to employment, access to housing, access to social services, all of those things connect to the conversation we had this morning about racism and discrimination, making it difficult to get access to the services we need. All of these biases impact and influence what happens in the housing market. Like I said, that landlord, sorry, there's nothing available for you when they see that relative of ours show up at the door to rent that house. Or, sorry, I don't care that you're giving me a year's worth of rent. You haven't had housing and you're in First Nation. I'm not giving you that. I'm not renting you my apartment. So we know that the lack of culturally relevant and safe services for our people has led to mistrust, and we're less likely to engage in services and less likely to find appropriate services. And the lack of culturally relevant services has meant that, in many cases, our people have been misdiagnosed and they've been treated inappropriately. They're given medication that may not be the issue. They're being treated for intergenerational trauma with medication. We know that intergenerational trauma cannot be treated with medication. The discrimination in the healthcare and the social service has led to so many harmful interactions for our people that has made it difficult for them to seek services. We know that people have said right from residential school, I had no services and healthcare, so I discouraged my children, my grandchildren from going for services. And then they've also felt excluded because nobody listens to them, understands their experiences, or is willing to find solutions that meet their needs. That limited access to resources and services has made it difficult for them to find that emotional and spiritual and physical and mental well-being to be able to live and enjoy a home. The chronic underfunding we have across all of our services, including housing, are part of the challenges we have in ensuring that we attend to homelessness, and overall, those ongoing harmful government policies. You know, those government policies are not just with our federal government and our provincial government, and our banking institutions as well. We don't give mortgages to First Nations people unless you get, it's co-signed by your band, if your band does that, if your First Nation does it. I lived in Sudbury for years. I owned my own home. It was a large home, worth lots of money. I sold it for lots of money, and I moved to the First Nation. I could not get my own mortgage. Nipissing had to co-sign my mortgage. Why? Right? Those institutional policies that suggest we need to be co-signed. Or why, then, if they co-sign, are we not seen as actually having a more stable mortgage because it's guaranteed? The band will always pay it, yet we can only get a little bit. We can't get enough. We can't even get a loan against our own homes. Those kinds of policies make it difficult for us to be able to enjoy housing that can support our family and our kin. There are a number of mental wellness challenges that put us at risk for homelessness. All of those ones that I mentioned are listed here. The intergenerational trauma has led to the increased likelihood of PTSD and other mood disorders. The disconnection from our cultural practices and our identity and our community make it much more likely that we will experience some form of mental health challenge, whether it's depression, anxiety, PTSD, or others. The substance use, often used as a coping mechanism to deal with colonial violence and traumas, have caused us a lot of spiritual and psychic pain. And when people use substances, it is to deal with that pain. And the brain can't tell the difference between spiritual and psychic pain or physical pain. It just knows it's in pain. So when it takes a medication like oxycodone for physical pain, and it alleviates your spiritual and psychic or emotional pain, it feels good, and it will continue to use that because it feels good. It relieves the pain. It makes somebody feel better for a minute, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, but it helps for a little while. Substance use issues have made it difficult for us to keep and maintain employment. It strains the relationships, and it makes it harder, therefore, to get access to stable housing. Like the member who was told, no, I don't care that you have a year's worth of rent. The impacts of homelessness on our wellness, in fact, create more mental wellness challenges. The stress and trauma of being homeless, living in an encampment, living on the streets, living in fear, living with potential dangers and harms, living without stable housing intensifies stress, makes it much, much, much harder to cope and manage, and therefore increases our exposure to violence, and it makes any pre-existing mental health challenge more pronounced, or it brings it out if it hadn't already been brought out. The cycle of instability from homelessness can exacerbate those mental health challenges, makes them much worse, and increases the reliance on our people to use substances as a way to cope and manage with stress because of that spiritual and psychic pain of the stress, because they don't have the coping skills to manage the stress. So as a result, it then again makes it more difficult to access housing. So it becomes a cycle of the mental health challenges that we have, creating stress and trauma, becoming homeless, and then not being able to get housing because we have more substance use and mental health challenges, and that goes on and on. So, we know what I've told you is nothing new for any of you. What do we do about it? We can build lots of houses in our communities. I'm not sure that will solve the problem all by itself. We need to think about strategies that are Indigenous or First Nations led that come directly from our communities. Those initiatives and programs need to start at the very spark of what can we do differently, to the design and the implementation that has to come from those people who are struggling with housing. Whether they're precariously housed, living in an encampment, perhaps afraid that they might be evicted the next day, they all need to come and speak and tell us about what they need, what the challenges were. We need to have youth in those conversations because our young people are more likely to end up homeless. We know that it starts earlier, so we have to hear from the youth. It needs to be informed by our cultural values about collectively caring for each other. We need to use our cultural values to talk about how do we as a community take ownership for everybody's well-being. How do we, whether we be a family member, a service provider, somebody in leadership, an elder, do we feel okay about our community members, our relatives, living without housing, living precariously? Are we okay with that? I don't think any of us are okay with that. If we're not okay with that, what does our kinship relationships tell us we need to do to support people, to help them to get back to housing? We all have something we can offer to somebody who is struggling with housing issues. A kind word, a non-judgmental interaction, acknowledgement of a gift or a strength that they have, a reminder that we are so proud they are part of our community. They need to know they belong and that they are connected. Inviting them into those sacred spaces to participate in ceremony, even if they're using. Giving them space to feel like they can find other ways to experience joy, happiness, no pain. Finding culturally relevant housing and support services are things we can do at program levels and system levels. We can develop services that attend to those needs of our relatives by looking at cultural and spiritual disconnection and loss. What do we need to do to address that? How do we make cultural practices available? How do we put perhaps land-based programs out there to help them rebuild those skills that they may have lost as a result of their substance use or those mental health challenges where they haven't had the opportunity to have the experiences or lost it because of extended exposure to substances. Getting them back out there to learn how to cook, how to make a fire, how to build a shelter. I tell my husband, we drive by an encampment that's just outside of Nipissing, outside one of their boundaries. And it's in a gray area, so it's not in North Bay, so North Bay doesn't tell them to move. Nipissing is not on their land, so they have a responsibility to it. But this encampment has grown, it's gotten very large. I hear they have generators, we see lights, they strung up lights. And I said to my husband, they're being human. They want to have a community. They have found like-minded people, and they've come together. And I bet you if we could be a fly on their wall, they support each other, they care about each other, they worry about each other. Why are we not interested in helping them be part of our community? Why do we let them have their own community aside from ours? If we have members in there, do we not owe them the ability to belong, to come back into our community and to be taken care of? We need to think about how we use cultural revitalization as ways to restore and rebuild not only our culture, but our social structures based on those values of collective well-being. How do we use healing-centered care that takes care of all of our people, using ceremonies and practices? How do we use our rights and understand our rights to advocate for what we need so that our people can become reconnected to our communities? How do we listen to those off-reserve members that say, there's no space for me there. Those are for me, I don't know what's going on, nobody tells me anything. Granted, we all have a responsibility to learn and get the information, but we also, those of us on reserve, have to think outside the box of how we reconnect our off-reserve members back to our community and make them feel like they belong. What do we do to invite them into the spaces? Then we have to think about prevention and intervention, or early intervention programs. So we really have to start targeting much earlier in these interventions. When people end up homeless, not that it's too late, but we didn't start early enough. We need to start early. We need to be emphasizing and focusing on our young people and youth programming around life skills, cultural connections, building relationships, teaching about how to cope and manage, learning about colonial violence, how to attend to that, recognize it, address it, talking about the harms, and giving them spaces to go to attend to that. We need to start earlier in these conversations. We need to invest in families and communities. We need to recognize that we must promote the health of our kids. We have to understand that we need to provide them with an opportunity for a continuum of housing services so that we can build them back up to being able to do what they need to do. So it might start in a shelter, it might go to supportive housing, there might be transitional housing, but I have a colleague who told me, let's stop using the word transitional housing because it suggests they have somewhere to go. So if we don't have somewhere for them to go, let's talk about supportive housing and creating a space so that they can move into permanent housing. In those spaces, we have to be thinking about harm reduction and abstinence-based approaches because we know our people are struggling with substance use and mental wellness challenges. We must be addressing at a community level the intergenerational trauma. And when we're talking about that, we best bring our housing department into the conversation. They need to come and talk to us. They need to understand intergenerational trauma, what it looks like, how it presents, what it looks like from a behavior point of view. They need to know those things. So when they're interacting with the renters, they're not going to say they must have been using, or they're crazy, or there's something wrong with them. They need to understand that what they're seeing in terms of the behaviors of a person is from intergenerational trauma, and it's survival skills. And how do we help them not live in constant threat of living from day to day in a survival mode? We need to think about systems change. How can we, as leaders, advocate for policy changes within our community? Just because the policy from Indigenous Service Canada says housing has to be a certain way, doesn't mean that's the only thing we can do. We can make our own policies. We are self-determining nations. We can do those things. We must also think about what are the policy changes when we are getting funding. How can we stretch the envelope of those funding policies? The housing department once said, the only housing we can build here under CMHC is a 3-bedroom house. Lots of our community members, families, they have big homes, they have big families. They've got 4 kids, maybe they're living with their aging parent, right? They're big. A 3-bedroom house doesn't suffice. But if our communities have funding, RHD is the odd example, they have additional funds available to them, they can take whatever money they have and build 5-bedroom houses, 6-bedroom houses. They can build supportive housing. Let's push those policies, not expect that all we have is what the government is telling us we can do. This allows us to attend to colonialism and racism. We need to be advocating for policy change, not only in housing, but in healthcare and social services, through the child welfare system, changing that to come from our own lens, and all of those other systems so that we're assuring equity in access to things like housing and healthcare and employment. We need, of course, increased funding. This one, whether we're living here in Ontario under a conservative government or about to probably go under a conservative government, this is going to be a challenge for us. How do we use our existing resources to help build the services we need? We have to attend to geographical needs. What they need in the north is different from what they need in the south. Close to urban, rural, we need to think about those considerations. And of course, we need to be distinction-based. What does First Nations need? That might look different. And with that, there we go. Happy to take a question if anyone has one, or are we out of time?
No, we're good. You got some time. I'll hold around the microphone. Can you get a microphone there?